Super exciting best decks update today. Our most recent OTA finally took meaningful power out of Thanos, shaved a little bit more off the top of discard, and left us with a wide open field. This is the first one of these videos I've recorded all year that does not contain Thanos, Destroy, or Discard. It's also worth noting that while those three decks are absent from this top roundup, they do still have all right stats, meaning if you are a diehard fan of them, you can play them and not feel bad about it. But if you're someone that's chasing the next best thing or like simply playing powerful decks, you don't need to feel obligated to play these decks that have been around for a while. Let's go ahead and dive on into all the juicy details. We've got a ton of sweet stuff to go over today. Kicking off this week with my Jeff picks like we often do. These are deck lists that I personally have been finding success with and enjoying while playing Marvel Snap. This first deck list, Angela Destroy, as I've been referring to it as, is the deck I used for the last leg of my climb back to Infinite through the 90s. This deck list basically looks to play a number of small packages of cards that have synergy with each other. We have Mockingbird with Mysterio, as well as Hood and Nico that generate extra cards that didn't start in our deck. We have a small Destroy package of Dakin's Muramasa Shard, Nova, as well as Hood that we can clear out with Killmonger as well as Carnage. And when we're blowing away these 1 energy cards with Killmonger from another lane, we can even deploy them into our Angela path to make her get larger before we blow them up. We round out the deck list with a healthy dose of interaction, Shang-Chi to chop down opposing really large cards, and Mobius to proactively disrupt things like Loki, Sarah, and other people looking to cheat on cost. And this deck list felt really well-rounded and competitive into basically everything we played it into. If you'd like to see this deck in action, be sure to check the video description down below for some games with it on my secondary channel. My second Jeff's pick today is my favorite deck list I've played with our latest season pass card. It is a Zemo Werewolf by Night deck. We have that typical bounce package that Werewolf by Night loves, a bunch of 1 energy on reveals that we can pick up and redeploy with Beast and Falcon, and we mix Yondu into this package so we can destroy the lowest cost cards in our opponent's deck, so that way Baron Zemo is more likely to pull a larger card out. Zemo is a card that we can play on curve turn 3 for reasonable stats, but we can also wait to deploy him later in the game to help Werewolf jump around the board on turns 5 and 6. Headlining features winning you a lot of games in this deck list is obviously our 3 disruptive cards at the top end of the curve. Dr. Octopus can yank your opponent's resources out of their hand after we've chopped up their deck, and Shang-Chi and Enchantress can chop anything the opponent deploys down to side by either removing ongoings or taking their biggest numbers and throwing them in the trash can. No deck list playing 3+4 energy cards would be complete without Zabu, which rounds out the final slot in this very disruptive and fun deck list. My last Jeff's pick this week is the deck list I used to slog through the 80s on my way back to Infinite, and that is an updated Bass Bounce featuring our freshly buffed Angela. This deck list plays a bunch of scaling threats, which are phenomenal with the deck's namesake, Bass. Another Bass interaction to be aware of if you've never played this deck list before is that when you Bast Mysterio, the Mysterio and all of his clones all play for 3 power. The last thing that I think is noteworthy about this particular build of Bounce, you're picking it up for the first time, is Stogard is a card you're going to think critically about how you play it. You can't just deploy it to the board aggressively and pick it back up to your hand because she's going to overfill your hand. That being said, I think Stogard is important for this deck for a couple of reasons. The first is the Hawk that she provides lets you cut your opponents off of Limbo, which takes your Living Tribunal matchup from being a nightmare to being quite reasonable for you. The second is that this deck loves to be able to spread out all over the board and play for all 3 lanes, which it does quite efficiently. But there's a lot of locations in Marvel Snap, Crimson Cosmos, Sanctum Sanctorum, that you can't get into, and that Hawk deployed on turn 5 changes that dynamic on its head, so you can basically always play to all 3 locations. Moving along to our high potential category, we have deck lists that have smaller sample sizes on Untapped so far, but have impressive stats within them, potentially meaning they could be the next big thing. We'll kick things off with an incredibly spicy Pixie War Machine deck that's hitting on a couple of different angles that are unique and look fun. To start with, we have the War Machine package paired with Ebony Maw and Infidant, so we can play these cards that have incredibly efficient stats while ignoring their drawback. And we have Pixie combined with not only Infidant but also Blob, She-Hulk, Professor X, and Cannonball, which are all excellent candidates to shuffle our 1 and 2 energy costs onto to make an unpredictable swing that your opponent's going to have a hard time keeping up with. The last small package in this deck that's interesting is Ravonna Renslayer discounts not only Professor X, but Blob as well, letting you get these cards down a turn ahead of schedule. Something that I think is especially interesting to note is if you pass on turn 5, soaking up 5 energy, you could play a 1 energy She-Hulk and a 5 energy Blob on turn 6, thanks to Ravonna. Our second high potential deck list this week is Thor Tech. This is the currently best performing post OTA variation of Tech card Mush, as I like to refer to it as in Snap. Basically, we've got every interactive card for every situation you can think of, including Mobius and Mobius for proactively disrupting opposing cost reduction decks. And then the Thor part of this deck is the primary way it generates numbers on the board to supplement its Tech cards kicking over your opponent's sand castles. The last couple of slots get devoted to utility cards like Jeff, letting you slip into hard to reach places, and Miss Marvel as well as Maximus, which are incredibly efficient numbers at very low energy costs. Moving along to our most popular and top performing deck list per Untapped stats so far post OTA, we have 3 different deck lists that each occupy about 10% of the games logged on Untapped so far. The first of these is actually one of the top performing deck lists on the tracker as well, and that is the Kitty Pryde Movers deck. Angela's buff back to 2/0 and +2 per card play into her lane really invigorated this archetype, especially with Hope Summers as a way for it to generate additional energy, letting you not only happily play Kitty Pryde out every turn, but also slam bigger cards like Vision and even our latest release in Red Hulk down as well. This deck list is phenomenal at making it difficult for your opponent to predict exactly how you're going to spread your stats out, because Vision and Jeff have freedom to move around the board. Silk is unpredictable in where she ends up at, and you could be finishing with your own massive stat stick in Red Hulk, or by chopping down something your opponent has on the board with a tech card like Shang-Chi. Our second popular deck in the roundup this week is Kitty Loki, another deck list that's leveraging our freshly buffed Angela. I think it is worth noting that while this deck list has a strong play rate currently, I wouldn't be surprised if that drops off over the coming week, because the actual performance metrics of this archetype definitely leave a bit to be desired. I think this deck is popular currently because it was a comfortable deck that you could slot the newly buffed Angela into, and the previous top dogs in the format, i.e. Discard and Thanos, took nerfs, making Loki comfort food for a lot of the more competitive spiky players looking for something to pick up in their stead. Our third deck list in the popular category this week is definitely the newest one on the scene, and that is variations of this Baron Zemo mill deck. Basic strategy, you're looking to use cards like Yondu, Gladiator, and Cable to thin your opponent's deck out, so Baron can hopefully get you something excellent onto your side of the board. It is worth noting that while these particular 12 cards are one of the higher sample variations of this archetype on Untapped, there's a lot of variation in the details. Things like Beast or Falcon, for example, letting you replay things like Yondu tend to be fairly common. I would say the 2 big mainstays across all of these variations tend to be the inclusion of Magic, since this deck list often can delete the opponent's deck by turn 7, creating an advantage where you get a card and they don't, as well as Dr. Octopus, who is a fantastic tool for taking away your opponent's resources they actually manage to draw proactively, often leaving them with nothing in hand to do on turn 6 and 7. Finally, we close things out today with a couple of the top performing deck lists on the Untapped tracker so far after our most recent over-the-air update, starting out with a Black Knight War Machine variation. It doesn't surprise me to see this deck having strong performance in the wake of Thanos getting cut down to size. This deck list gets to put really impressive stats into play, thanks to not only Black Knight's Ebony Blade, but also Ghost Rider, letting you bring back either the Infinite or Giganto at an incredibly reduced rate. And because this deck list is leveraging Zabu as a 4 energy cost reducer, you get to play Shang-Chi as a powerful tech card, and this particular list is mixing in Shadow King as well, but other things like Enchantress or Rogue often see play in this archetype as well. Finally, the War Machine part of this deck list not only allows you to mitigate some location variance into things like Sanctum Sanctorum, but it also works around the drawback that Giganto and Infinite typically have, allowing your deck list to be a little bit more consistent in deploying big numbers in the games where your discard synergies simply don't come together. Our final deck list in the roundup this week, and closing out the high potential category, is this Cannonball Clutter deck. Cannonball's honestly a card I've been reasonably impressed with in deck lists like this one, where you're filling up your opponent's board consistently. Being able to blow up their largest card while also adding 8 points of our own is nothing to scoff at. This deck list has a ton of ways to clog the opponent's board up, whether it's Professor X single-handedly locking down a lane, or Annihilus in tandem with Debris and Goblins. Your opponent's often going to be struggling for board space on that 6th final turn of the game. What a fantastic roundup of sweet deck lists. It feels good to not only be out from underneath the thumb of Thanos after spending many months underneath it, but Angela is honestly just everything I love about Marvel Snap. She's a card that rewards you for good choices during the game, has sweet synergy to consider while you're building your deck, and plays in a variety of lists in different ways. I would love to know what you've been finding success with on your climb back to Infinite in the comments down below. And buckle up, folks, the format's sweet now, but remember, there's more change coming on Tuesday with the patch. Looking forward to breaking all that down for you next week when we get the details.